coming. This is Church of Praxeology is an idea that of creating a community of liberty-minded people that's different from other things. It's based on the model of a church, or modeled after a church that kind of uses that structure to build a community as opposed to a think tank or other organizations. We appreciate any feedback. It's still a work in progress. It's a rotating location now, at least for a while, until we kind of get the format set, I guess. The first thing I want to do, this is a dedication to liberty. It's something we're trying to formulate some core ideas. And this is something, again, it's not a prayer, but it's kind of based on that model. It's something that affirms belief or our values. I'm just going to read it now. We come together today to assert and affirm our beliefs. We believe that every individual owns his or her own life and property. We believe that ownership is complete and unconditional. We believe that no person or persons are ever justified in using aggression to violate that ownership. We believe in a world without involuntary tax. We believe a world without involuntary taxation is possible. We believe that such a world would be preferable and is in fact necessary for our continued existence as a species. We hereby commit ourselves to work by whatever means necessary to bring about such a world. So this again is a work in progress, but please let us know if you have any feedback, if you want to participate more, or help formulate some of these ideas. There's a card to fill out if you have a chance, if you want to. The first thing, one thing we've tried in the past is we called it petitions at first, and it was sort of based on in a church there's always a period where the floor is kind of opened up to people who have announcements, people who have an idea they just want to get out among people, among the rest of the community, to people who just have something on their mind. I want to open that up now. I don't have anything prepared, but and we've sort of put this in and taken it out a few times. Based on attendance and other things. But does anyone have anything they want to bring up right now, or any announcements or anything like that?
The idea here is specifically if there's something the state does, government does that you don't like, it's a chance to air in the community. You know, this is something that we need to express publicly and give a voice to that. So, you know, before we talked about people who are, millions of people are in jail, you know, right now, you know, for non-violent drug crimes and non-violent non-crimes. And, you know, if we were in jail for that, we would want people bringing it up. Or, I'm trying to think what else we can talk about, you know, it's just a chance for people to express. I mean, generally we have people here who are really into liberty and so do you guys have anything that comes to mind, like, you know, this is a pet issue I have, why are we at war or something, you know, that you want to maybe give voice to?
We also toyed with the idea of calling it the airing of grievances, like Festivus. And one idea, like Steve was saying, is among activist communities, places where there's really a core group of active people, especially with civil disobedience, people go to jail. And it's like this, there's communities like this in New Hampshire, in Austin, in the past in Orlando, where there's just a lot of liberty-minded people that are very active. And, so that's an idea too. That's part of this too, is to help get the word out.
Well, those two examples that Steve mentioned are, well, I'm here just sort of a guest observer, but coming from that outsider situation, not necessarily having a history in this community. Those two are nice examples as good synergy opportunities with the radicals on the other side that I'm afraid get rid of the criminalization of kind of petty nonviolent drug crimes. Ruins a whole generation of disadvantaged inner city youth for their entire lives, and then on the other hand, the war and all the things that happen. That's what it's there's some synergy opportunities. Different motivations from the morning.
Yeah, that combined with work restrictions, minimum wage laws in the inner city, it's a deadly combination. Kids can't get jobs and are caught up in this drag.
And I would also suggest, although I don't know if this is as synergetic, because I think a lot of people on the other side would disagree with this, but housing subsidies are horrible for the inner city because it enables people to not work. It enables them to not, it's just they have, now they can live for next to nothing, and they're not incentivized to make something of themselves. So all these things go in. It's like it's good. These programs are set up with good intentions in mind, but it ends up, we're going to criminalize drugs. We're going to give you money to live because we don't think you can take care of yourself, which is absurd. We're going to raise minimum wages, which prices them out of the labor market, and all of a sudden, these kids are very angry at the world, which makes complete sense because nothing works right for them. So. I said, I don't know if it's as synergetic because I don't think most people are for housing subsidies on the other side. So the other side.
No, it's good to exchange of ideas. Ideas.
Want to go to the talk first or go to the reading?
Yeah, ask you maybe if you wanted to read. To read. Let's do the first reading first, then I'll say something, then we'll do the second reading, and I'll do my speech.
Hello, my name's Ian. Adam Smith's Theory of Moral Sentiments. The great pleasure of conversation and society besides arises from a certain correspondence of sentiments and opinions, from a certain harmony of minds, which like so many musical instruments coincide and keep time with one another. But this most delightful harmony cannot be obtained unless there is a free communication of sentiments and opinions. We all desire upon this account to feel how each other is affected, to penetrate into each other's bosoms, and to observe the sentiments and affections which really subsist there. The man who indulges us in this natural passion, who invites us into his heart, who, as it were, sets open the gates of his breast to us, seems to exercise a species of hospitality more delightful than any other. No man who is in ordinary good temper can fail of pleasing if he has the courage to utter his real sentiments as he feels them, and because he feels them, and because he feels them.
For that reading. So I wanted to try something this we have not done before, but I've been going to different church services in the last year, sort of as market research, and trying to see what things they do that we can somehow do in a similar way that addresses liberty. We don't have a God in our church. We don't take a position on God. The church that we're trying to start here is complementary if you believe in a higher power, but it's also stands on its own if you don't. But I thought when I was at church recently, I thought, praying is a very emotionally satisfying thing, and how could we pray without God? And I thought, you know, maybe for people who don't believe in God, you could pray to your community. So I thought maybe we could try this. Maybe we could try doing a prayer, but when we pray, we'll be directing it towards each other. So I wanted to just try this. If this seems gimmicky to you, or this is stupid, you don't want to go along with it, don't feel that you have to. But I thought maybe I could recite a prayer. We could all sort of bow our heads, and instead of praying to God, it will be directed towards, you say, like the person who sits to your right, and then we'll have a circle here. And then we'll see how it works. We'll see if this if registers emotionally. Maybe this will be the only time we try it. So let's take a moment and pray. Dear friend, thank you for coming here today. I know that you, like me, have many things that are different pressures that are pulling on your time. I know that you would prefer perhaps to have slept in today. You want to spend more time with your loved ones, with your friends. There are things that you could do to help you make more money. And nevertheless, you chose to come here and spend your Saturday morning fighting for a cause that's larger than you, the cause of human liberty. I want you to know that I admire you for that. And I think that you should be proud of yourself for being here. Amongst the millions of people in this city, the few of us, you and I and everyone else here, have come together to fight for this thing. And it's a reason to be proud, and I just want to thank you for coming. Amen. So maybe now we'll have the other reading.
The man of the government is apt to be very wise in his own conceit, and is often so enamored with the supposed beauty of his own ideal plan of government that he cannot suffer the smallest deviation from any part of it. He seems to imagine that he can arrange the different members of a great society with as much ease as the hand arranges the different pieces upon a chessboard. He does not consider that the pieces upon the chessboard have no principle of motion besides that which the hand impresses upon them. But that in the great chessboard of human society, every single piece has a principle of motion of its own, altogether different from that which the legislature might choose to impress upon it. If those two principles coincide and act in the same direction, the game of human society will go on easily and harmoniously. It is very likely to be happy and successful. If they are opposite or different, the game will go on miserably, and the society must at all times in the highest degree, and the society must be at all times in the highest degree of disorder.
Okay, thanks again for that reading. So what I want to talk about for my sermon today is praxeology. Praxeology is in the name of our organization, and we're thinking about changing it. We were talking about this earlier, to change it so we don't call it a church. And maybe we're not going to call it church anything of praxeology either. But the point is, whether we call it, we have praxeology in the name or not, praxeology is central to our message. And it's central to the ideas of liberty. And so I thought it was overdue for sort of an elaboration of what exactly praxeology is. So that's what I would like to lay out for you today. First, let me just give you a simple definition of praxeology. It's on that handout. Praxeology, the deductive method of understanding human nature. Praxeology is a method of understanding human nature. Now I want to make a claim. When the ideas of praxeology get hold in the general population, the world is going to radically be transformed. It's going to completely change how we structure society. It'll be a world that is very different from the world we live in now, that our parents lived in, grandparents lived in, that as it was structured 500 years ago. Praxeology is a transformative method of understanding human nature. So I believe we are entering into what I would call the praxeological age. Let me give you an analogy. I just recently watched a documentary on the development of the atomic bomb in Manhattan Project. And it was a really good documentary for people who are interested in the state. It talked about the psychology of these scientists they weren't political. And all of a sudden they created this thing and hundreds of thousands of people died because of this weapon. And what does that mean? And they were struggling with that. So that was interesting. But more relevant to this talk was how quickly these theoretical ideas of physics went from just pure theory to practical implementation. Just in a few decades. The theories that led to the atomic bomb, relativity and the structure of the atom, the binding forces of the nucleus in the atom, all of these had been developed only 2, 3, or 4 decades prior to World War II. And so many of the people who had worked on these theories when they were young lived to see the nuclear age. They lived to see the bomb being dropped, the result of their work being used in such a horrible manner. And what was interesting from this documentary is some of these scientists who had done the theoretical work, who worked on the project, they said, we knew, we had calculated how powerful that this explosion was going to be. We knew that there was going to be this chain reaction. We knew that if we set up a certain amount of purified uranium or plutonium, it would cause this thing. We knew that it would be a certain number of kilotons, equivalent of TNT. But it wasn't until we were at the test site in Trinity, New Mexico in 1945, and we're 2 or 3 miles away in a bunker. And the explosion goes off in the middle of the night, and the sky lights up like it's daytime, and we hear this just unbelievable roar, and we see this flash of light that we knew viscerally that we had unleashed a new force that was going to change the world. And so all the time they're working on the theories, they're like, this seems like it would work, but it wasn't until they actually saw it happen that they realized, wow, this is real. This is an analogy to what's going on now with the ideas of the method of praxeology and the ideas of liberty that we're trying to promote. We are in the theoretical phase. The theory has been developed, the pure theory has been developed, but we are trying to figure out how to practically implement that. And what we're doing with the Church of Praxeology, or whatever we end up calling it, is part of that process. We're tinkering. We're trying to see how we can get these ideas out into the general public. The substrate that we're working on is not uranium or plutonium. The chain reaction we're trying to create doesn't come about with anything like that. The substrate we're working with is human minds. And we are trying to discover how to start this chain reaction. And when we do, it's going to be the same thing as the scientists who, they tinkered in theory for a long time and then all of a sudden it happened. It's going to create the same unbelievable explosion, you could say, and transform civilization as we know it. And it might not be in our lifetime that this happens. The benefit that people who were working in the atomic bomb had is that they had a war that was going on that was, the state had a reason. The state had almost unlimited funds with which to bring about this weapon. And so there was this very quick acceleration. With the ideas of praxeology and the ideas of liberty, the state doesn't even want us, much less support us to bring this into fruition. So we're working sort of freelance. And so it might take longer. It might not be in our lifetime that we see this happen. But I believe that it will happen at some point. And like I said, that will usher in the praxeological age, which is going to be very different. So you might be thinking, okay, well, what is praxeology? You've certainly built it up enough. So let me just repeat. Praxeology is the deductive method of understanding human action. Praxeology falls within a larger philosophical field of thought, which is epistemology. If you don't know what epistemology is sort of meta philosophy. Epistemology studies what basically tries to answer these questions. What do we know for sure, and how do we know it? So epistemology, it's theorizing about, it's theories about how we theorize. It's knowledge about how we know stuff. It's hypothesizing about how we hypothesize. Epistemology is reflexive knowledge. It's knowledge about ourselves. And for that reason, epistemology is epistemological arguments become very complicated very quickly because they're recursive. Because anytime you make an argument, if I make an argument in epistemology, that argument has to encompass my argument. And so when you read philosophers who talk about knowledge, it's very dense. So I'm going to try and keep this as simple as possible. But the point is epistemology tries to answer the questions, what do we know for sure and how do we know it? Now this discussion has been going on for all of Western history, really. And over the last few hundred years, epistemology has fallen out into two separate camps, broadly speaking. The first camp are the empiricists. And what the empiricists say is the only thing you can know are the things that you can detect with your senses. It's empirical. Their story, their message is our senses are our means of understanding reality. And so anything you say you know independent of your senses it doesn't count. It's not real. Only things that you have in your senses. And so any knowledge you have that can be detected with your senses, you can make a theory about it and it has to be disprovable. In other words, theoretically someone could disprove it. You know, at this table I say it's wood. Why? I knock on it, it sounds like it's wood. But someone could disprove that. You know, you could bring in like a testing kit and say actually it's whatever, plastic. And there are other types of theories like this. Theory of gravity, you know, it's just a theory. I mean, we think it is. People have tried to disprove it and they haven't, but they could eventually disprove the theory of gravity. So these are all this is all the knowledge we know through our senses, empirical knowledge. Those are the empiricists. The other school within the broader category of epistemology are the rationalists. And the rationalists say basically the exact opposite. The rationalists say, on the contrary, our senses can deceive us. Things that we detect with our senses are a filter. So we don't know for sure what it really exists. Our senses may or may not be telling us the truth. And so the rationalists say there is a type of knowledge, though, that we can be sure of. It's knowledge that the only type of knowledge we can be sure of, in fact, is knowledge that comes to us independently of our senses. Knowledge that exists, what they call a priori, knowledge that comes to us before we have any sense input at all. And they're one of the godfather of the rationalist movement, our school of thought, is Immanuel Kant, and he had this thought experiment. Imagine you have no sense data. What would you still necessarily know? And starting from there, it's this a priori, prior to our senses. And the rationalists call empirical data a posteriori, data that comes after we start sensing things. So those are broadly the two schools of epistemology. People who say only empirical data is real, shows reality, and people who say actually only the things we know prior to sense data is absolutely for sure, and everything else is conditional. Now, praxeology fits within the rationalist school. Praxeology is a way to try to understand this a priori data, this knowledge of things before we have any sense input. So let's do some praxeology. Let's try to think about what things can we know independently of sense data. Praxeology starts with a fundamental axiom, the axiom of human action. Humans act. This is not a statement that you can dispute. Nobody could say humans don't act. I mean, you can say it, but if you said it, you yourself are acting by saying that. So you would contradict yourself if you would say humans don't act. So this is sort of a necessary truth. Well, what else can we say that is a necessary truth? We can say that humans act purposefully. And again, you might say, well, I don't think humans act purposefully, but in doing that, you yourself are acting purposefully. You yourself have a purpose that you're using when you say people don't act purposefully. So this is praxeology, elaborating sort of self-evident truths that can't be contested and using this as a deductive method. What else can we say that's absolutely for sure? Indisputable knowledge, indisputable a priori knowledge. Well, humans act purposefully in time. And you might say, well, I agree with you that humans act purposely, but I don't think they act purposely in time. I'm not sure that you've convinced me there's time. But if there was no time, you wouldn't be saying that. See, when I say something, I'm saying it because I'm trying to create a future state that is preferable. So right now I'm saying this because I want to convince you of what I'm saying. If there was no time, I would already be at that future state. And so I wouldn't be acting. And so in the same way, the person who says, I don't agree that humans act purposely in time, he himself is implying there's time because he's saying it now instead of just being in that future state that he says doesn't, So this is how praxeology works. You can't contest these truths without making a logical contradiction. What else? Humans act purposely in time. Humans act purposely in time, and they follow priorities. They have certain things that are more important than others. You could say, well, I don't agree with that. But again, when you say that you don't agree with that, you yourself are acting. You're showing your priority at that moment is to say that thing. If it wasn't, you would do something else, because that would be the most important thing. So you can't dispute these statements. They're necessarily true. And you can go on and on. This is how praxeology works. You keep going, elaborate these things that you have to agree with. And I'll just do one more. Humans can learn. Well, you say well, I don't think humans can learn. Well, then you want to say it. The only reason you're saying that humans can't learn is because you are trying to convince somebody. I mean, if you don't think it can learn, you wouldn't be saying, or somebody can learn, you wouldn't be saying it. There'd be no point. So you clearly do think people can learn. So this is praxeology. It's a deductive method of understanding human action, human nature. Now, you might think to yourself, that's sort of interesting, but I don't really see how that's going to change the world, because you've pretty much just told me common sense stuff. Humans act purposely, no duh. Humans act, have priorities. I already knew that. What's the big deal here? Well, the big deal here is that understanding why humans do what they do, understanding human action, is the great quest of economics. This is what economics is all about. This is what economists try to figure out. Why do humans act in a certain way? And the problem we have this day and age is most economists act as if empiricists. Most economists try to go out, gather empirical data about how humans act, and devise theories. But the problem is they don't understand that they are the subject of their theory. They're trying to understand themselves. And so in the Austrian School of Economics, which is where praxeology is developed, we look at most economists and we're just like, what are you doing? You're going out collecting all this data, and the answer is within you. The answer is to think deductively about how you yourself think. There's no magic equation here. So they have the method. They have their method wrong. They're going about it using the wrong method. They should be using a deductive method, the a priori knowledge about how they act to understand human action. That's all that's needed. So this is the big problem we have today, is the methods of economics are wrong, and the methods about how people, not even economists, but how other people think about economics. They don't see that when you talk about economics, you're talking, the subject matter is yourself. So let's just, in case this hasn't registered, let's just imagine a guy who's a economist. And maybe he was raised as a physicist or something, but he wants to try to apply the same, flesh out the same sort of truths from economics. He says, I know physics, so he goes into the School of Economics and he uses the same empirical methods. He says, okay, well, let's look at the data. Let's look at our sense data. And he observes humans doing these things that I already talked about. He says humans act purposefully. Well, I know that qualitatively, but what I liked about physics is that in physics, you could make formulas, you could make equations, and that these different variables, then you could manipulate them, you could plug them into models. So, you know, in physics, you say like two bodies surround themselves, it's the cube and the square of, like, you know, the two variables, and then you can manipulate. I want to do that with this knowledge of human action. So humans act purposely. How do I make an equation about that? Let's see. Well, I could say humans equals h is a variable, and acts purposely in time. Maybe acts is equal, and purposely in time would be a function. So I could say h equals p function t, right? H equals p parentheses t. That's an equation. Now I can work with that. And then you say, well, like humans learn. Let's see, how do I make an equation about that? Well, I could say h equals, maybe h equals L. I mean, you see how this doesn't work. You see how you can't make equations out of a priori truths. You can't make, this type of knowledge does not lend itself to abstraction in formulas. It takes all the meaning out of it. It doesn't help you in any way to do this. So, but if you're treating humans as if they're an empirical, external subject, then you're necessarily going to try and create these equations, and they're going to mislead you. And that's what you see in all economists do. If you read a traditional economics textbook, it's full of these just unbelievably obscure, you know, huge chains of equations about explaining human nature. And if you read an Austrian economist textbook, it's just this deductive, logical. There's no math. It's just deductive, logical, these are true themselves. You don't gain anything by abstracting them and using formulas. So anyway, I've tried to just touch on what praxeology is all about, what the Austrian school is all about. I think that these ideas, when we can get people to start seeing that all macroeconomics is flawed. None of it is right. If you read the Wikipedia page on praxeology, it says the detractors say it would mean all macroeconomics is invalid. Well, that's exactly right. It is invalid. Because you can't aggregate people. Because each individual person is unique. So I just want to end with a little parable. If you don't take anything else away from this discussion, maybe this will help you sort of encapsulate what I've been saying. There's this scientist, you know, who he's brilliant. And when he's only in his early 20s, he discovers this brilliant new insight into particle physics, you know, and it shocks the world, and everyone's like, that's just genius. And then the guy says, okay, well, I've made my mark in physics, now I'm going to see if I can do the same in chemistry. He goes into chemistry, and again, in just a few years, he does something that no one has ever seen before, learning how to extract a protein or something like that. And everyone's like, this is the greatest mind of our generation. And the guy, he's 30 now, and he says, you know, and he's believing what he's been hearing about himself. And he says, I'm going to tackle the great challenge of our time, which is economics. I'm going to do the same thing with humans that I did with physics and chemistry. And he has such a claim that he actually gets audience with leaders around the world, and he finds a third world dictator who's still a country that still has slaves. And he convinces this guy, look, I need subjects for my experiments. You know, I need, like, I know there's people who have moral, ethical, you know, they're backward people, but like, this is for science. So I want to run some experiments, and we're going to crack the code about what humans are all about. And the guy gives him the money and the lab and the slaves. And so this guy goes out like he's done in physics, like he's done in chemistry, and he starts collecting empirical data. All the ideas about, you know, the connections between humans and why they act this way. And he comes up with a theory. He thinks maybe this is it, you know. The theory says if you do X, Y, Z to humans, they'll act in a manner like A. So he sets up this lab, he does X, Y, Z, and he looks to see what happens, and his humans react in a manner of B. And he's like, that's all right. It's the first try. You know, I'm just testing the water here. Maybe I haven't controlled all my variables. Maybe my model's wrong. but let's see if I can repeat it. And he does X, Y, Z again. And this time, they act like C. And this is very frustrating because he hasn't even perfected the model yet. And he keeps repeating this, and each time he does it, people act in a different way. And this is maddening to him, you know. And he's not the type that's going to give up. He's not the type that, you know, he's got his challenge to solve, and he's going to stick with it. And this goes on for years and years, decades and decades. He keeps trying to perfect his model. He can't figure it out. And until eventually, later in his life, he goes mad. He goes insane. He gets condemned to a sanatorium, and everyone said, I don't know what happened to that guy. And towards the end of his life, in the last few days of his life, he gets this cryptic note. And he doesn't know who he sent it to. He opens it up, and he reads this, and it says, thanks for being our subject. See, he was the subject of his own experiments. This is what he didn't understand. When he's studying humans, he's studying himself. And he never saw that. He thought they were something different than him. So this is what we're seeing in this day and age, all the time. These politicians, the economists, they don't understand that everyone they look at, everyone they rule over, is just like them. You know, they're not different. And the Praxeology teaches us this. And so I guess that's pretty much all I have. And I guess, you know, before we adjourn, does anyone have any thoughts or questions? Okay, well, thanks everyone for coming, and usually we like to go out for brunch afterwards, so if anyone wants to join us, I don't know what's around here, but I'm sure we can find some place. So. Thank you.